Today is May the 9th, usually the day Russia pulls out all the stops for its biggest military flex of the year. It's the anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany. And Red Square is normally a wall-to-wall display of military hardware. But if you look at the footage from today, something's missing. The parade was massively scaled back. No tanks, no heavy artillery, no intercontinental missiles rolling over the cobbles. So, why that low-key energy? Well, for one, Russia is now 5 years into its war with Ukraine, and most of the heavy gear is probably tied up at the front, actually shooting. But there's also the security factor. Moscow is genuinely on edge about potential Ukrainian strikes hitting the heart of the capital. More on that a bit later. Interestingly, one thing that was on show for the second year in a row was a large contingent of troops from North Korea, which has reinforced Russia's military. It's all a huge contrast to what we saw even a year ago, when the Kremlin was still projecting that business-as-usual powerhouse image. Now, the optics are very different. And we'll look into the reasons for that. We take stock of how the war's going for Russia and examine the shifting power dynamics in the Kremlin. We'll also look at how support for Putin might be waning, both among the Russian elite and the general population. But first, let's hear how the Kremlin's inner circle and President Putin himself are spinning this rather minimalist version of Russia's most important holiday.
All measures are being taken to minimize the danger from the terrorist threat. The parade will happen, but let's not forget that it was a large-format Jubilee parade last year, as it should have been on a round date. This year is not a Jubilee, but the parade will still happen, although in a truncated form. I won't say anything unexpected, but for our people, for our citizens, this is still important. We didn't officially invite anyone. We simply said that we would be glad to see anyone who wants to come. This is, I think, especially relevant and natural in today's situation, given the security issues.
Let's bring in our correspondent, Juri Rescheto, who is covering Russia for us from Riga, since DW's office in Moscow was shut down by the Kremlin. Juri, you have been to these parades in previous years. Tell us what it felt like in the past and how it compares to what we've seen today.
Well, Gerhard, you really felt the difference this year. I've stood indeed on Red Square before, during these parades twice, and back then you could literally feel the ground shake as tanks and missile systems rolled past. That physical show, together with Putin's speech, of show of power, was always the message. This time, that element was completely missing, you said it. Instead, it played out more like a television show with long video sequences of military hardware, kind of movie blockbuster with close-ups of the latest technical high-precision Russian weapons. But all of this on a screen, replacing the real things. So Putin was just sitting and watching this like a movie. And the guest list was also much smaller, mainly leaders from the so-called allied countries, and no Western journalists at all. They were all disinvited a day ago. But beyond the parade, Gerhard, it's important to stress May 9 still matters in Russia. People continue to mark it in a very personal way. Families gathering, remembering relatives who fought in World War II. So that family, that personal part is still very real and very important for Russians.
Now, how was this very modest affair then received in Russia by ordinary Russians?
Well, people in Russia are definitely noticing or have noticed that something was different, no heavy equipment, no far fewer people and extremely tight security. Large parts of Moscow were shut down and even mobile internet was completely blocked in some places for days. In some major cities, including Nizhny Novgorod, Russia's third largest city, parades didn't happen at all. In St. Petersburg, the parade was much smaller than initially planned. Instead of 5,000 people, there were only 300. So while there is no sense of panic, there is definitely a growing unease. The war is no longer something far away. Russians realize Ukrainian drone attacks now reach deep into Russian territory, hitting infrastructure and affecting daily life. So this smaller parade is widely understood as a reflection of that, a sign that the situation is becoming more complicated and less secure for all Russians.
Now, you mentioned attacks, of course, in Russia itself. Quite interestingly, President Zelenskyy has joked about allowing Russia to hold the parade without interruption by his forces. Now, let's have a look at what he said. Zelenskyy says, "I decide to allow a parade in Moscow on May 9th, 2026, and that Red Square will be excluded from the plan for the use of Ukrainian weapons." He then also gives the exact coordinates of Red Square. And the Kremlin, perhaps unsurprisingly, was struggling to adjust its sense of humor. Putin's spokesman Peskov responded.
Woe to anyone who tries to mock Victory Day and make stupid jokes. That's their issue. We don't need anyone's permission to be proud of our Victory Day.
Juri, did other people in Russia get Zelenskyy's joke?
Well, I don't know how serious Zelenskyy's decree was. It was a joke meant. So he is, after all, the president of Ukraine. But yeah, there is a clear sense of irony, and irony was heard in Russia. We've just heard the reaction from Dmitry Peskov. He said this on television, state television, ahead of the parade. He also issued a warning, Gerhard, saying anyone who tries to mock Victory Day or make such foolish jokes, he says, should be careful. So in Moscow, the view is that the parade is a domestic matter, and this kind of statement doesn't really change the situation on the ground.
Now, what's the current level of support among Russians for Putin's war cause there?
Well, today's parade is a clear indicator, I would say, of the mood in the country and the support of Putin, or for Putin. The parade was supposed to project strength, but the atmosphere feels tense. Security is tighter and the show itself was smaller. At the same time, pressure is building, economic strain, tighter internet controls and visible cracks among elites. Even pro-war voices are criticizing decisions like blocking Telegram and targeting VPNs in Russia. Official polls suggest that Putin's popularity has dropped to its lowest point since the war began. The system itself seems to be starting to look more divided. There is reportedly increasing friction between different power groups, especially between the FSB, the Internal Intelligence Service, and parts of the presidential administration. Public support hasn't collapsed, but there is noticeable fatigue. Many Russians still support the leadership outwardly, yet there is a growing sense that the war is becoming a heavy, long-term burden. And I would say some cautious criticism is emerging without openly challenging those in power. All in all, this year's May 9 parade looks less like a strong display, but more like an attempt to calm nerves in a tense and uncertain situation.
DW correspondent Juri Rescheto there reporting. Thank you. And we can now bring in Domitilla Sagramoso. She's a senior lecturer in security and development, King's College London, for some deeper analysis of the current situation there. Domitilla, thank you for joining us for this segment. For the first time in decades, we are seeing a Victory Day parade without tanks or any heavy equipment. What does this absence say about the current state of Russia's military?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting when we think about the absence in the parade in Red Square of tanks, because I was looking a bit at the figures, and it seems that Russia has lost in these wars in the last years around a total of over 4,000 tanks and over 9,000 armored infantry vehicles. That's a really significant number. It's over 50% of its whole total equipment, and a lot of the equipment that belonged to the sort of Soviet era has sort of been burned out. So it's clear that Russia, is being much more careful with making sure that there is no maybe attack, not necessarily during the parade itself, but maybe a bit earlier or after, because all this weaponry and tanks would have to be stored somewhere before the parade. So that was really highly risky. I mean, the estimate said that Russia has around 2,000 tanks now that are fully functional. So certainly Russia, and I'm just talking about this particular kind of military hardware because it's usually used in these parades. So clearly Russia has an issue with military equipment, although we know when we look at the front lines, the way the war is developing, due to this high level of transparency that is provided by drones, tanks and other kind of military hardware are not always used so openly as they were used in the first year of the war, because they are at great exposure and danger of attack and destruction. So the nature of the war is also changing.
Now, we saw that rather tongue-in-cheek decree there from President Zelenskyy allowing the parade to proceed. How does this kind of psychological signaling from Kyiv affect the Kremlin's narrative of being the dominant force in this war?
Yeah, I think that already the request by Putin of a ceasefire during those days indicated that, he was no longer in such a strong position as he was in the past and as he usually wants to portray. So the message or the decree by President Zelenskyy was just an addition to this, in a way, this humiliation by Putin. And it's not clear what role exactly Trump played, but I mean, it is possible that Putin suggested to Trump that he wanted Trump to put pressure on Zelenskyy. So all this may indicate, that Russia had to really humiliate itself, and the fact that they have to really say clearly that, there might be a terrorist attack, so-called, from Ukrainians, I mean, shows that they have become extremely vulnerable, because Ukrainians now have developed long-range strike capabilities that are able to hit really very far away, and they can be also very precise and very damaging, as we've seen with attacks on oil terminals and refineries. So Russia also has a disadvantage that it's such a huge country that in that respect, it is hard to have a defensive system that covers the entire territory. So the risk is also that when maybe Moscow is not attacked during this parade, other areas that have been less properly defended become the target of attack, because a lot of the air defense system is transferred to Moscow and other more secure, areas that need to be secured. So this whole situation, was highly risky for Putin, and it really shows that he's no longer in such a dominant position as he was in the past.
Talking about the international support we did see leaders from Belarus, Malaysia and Laos in attendance. What does that say about the global support that Putin has?
I think what it shows more than anything is that the world generally is focused on other challenges related to the war in Iran, in the Gulf, to the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, the challenges with skyrocketing energy prices in some areas of the Far East. And that really challenges the economies of many of these countries and focus the attention of these leaders on these very immediate very serious issue. So the idea that they're going to go to Moscow and show solidarity with Putin may not be considered sort of the most adequate way and the adequate response, because the situation globally is so critical that it's probably the moment when leaders are trying to figure out what is the best way ahead and how they can manage these other challenges. You know, what is also interesting is that we have a lot less military troops from other countries. In the past, last year we had troops from, Egypt, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam. I mean, now we might have the representatives and the leaders of some of these countries, but we no longer have this massive display of foreign troops as well, besides, of course, as you mentioned, North Korean troops. So, it indicates to me more than Russia being isolated, Russia not being sort of the center of the attention anymore. I think that is really important. I mean, this war has now been superseded in terms of concerns by the wars in the Middle East.
That's definitely true. Now, let's talk about President Trump, who has brokered that 3-day ceasefire for this holiday. Do you see this as a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, or is it just a little tactical breather that both sides are using to regroup?
I'm afraid that this might just be a momentary ceasefire. I don't see an intention of the Russians to really push ahead with a significant ceasefire. I mean, it might lead to something more significant, and we're all hoping that that would be the case. I think the Ukrainians are particularly interested in having this sort of extended ceasefire, and they've been asking for it for the last over a year from now already. They've been asking for an extended ceasefire. So the Ukrainians, are probably very supportive of these kind of, extension of these kind of ceasefires. They also got the release of 1,000 prisoners of war in an exchange with the same number with Russians. So they are seeing some advantages. But I think that, if we look at what happened a few days ago, I mean, the Russians are bombarding heavily Sumy, a kindergarten was hit. There was massive bombardment also in Konstantinivka in the Donetsk Oblast. So the fighting is very, very intense in those areas on the front line in terms of Russian bombardment. But I mean, it couldn't be excluded that this can provide the basis for further negotiations. And as was mentioned in your segment, I mean, there is now much stronger pressure on the Kremlin to do something about this war. The public discontent is mounting. We see sort of manifestations of that, which we wouldn't have seen a year or so ago. So clearly something is happening, something is brewing. We really don't know exactly what it is. So I think it's maybe early days, but maybe this could be the start. It could be a model that could be replicated for longer.
Now, you said discontent is growing also within the Russian nomenclatura, if you will, the pro-war elite. Is that a bigger threat for Putin now, maybe even bigger than the liberal opposition ever has been?
Well, I think that these Z bloggers and the more nationalist opposition, they are very vociferous. They are listened to. They can develop narratives, but they've also been quite critical of the way Russia's been conducting this war, and they might exert pressure on Russia to bomb massively the offices of the presidential administration in Ukraine, for example. But I think that Putin will be able to manage that. And what was interesting is there was reports coming out of the Kremlin and the presidential administration trying to see how they could manage this extremist nationalist constituency if they decide to move ahead and find a negotiated outcome, which is also, as I said, a possibility. So I think they're probably preparing scenarios of how to handle that. And I don't think that these are individuals that are ready to sort of topple the regime. We've seen with, for example, Prigozhin, how that ended up. The state has a massive structure of repression that they can use, in terms of military police, Rosguardia, the FSB, intelligence. it's very hard to carry out something from outside of the system. I think what is possible is that we see pressures inside the system and people sort of hinting at Putin that his time is sort of over and that he should slowly make a move. But whether that would really happen and whether he would be ready to do that, I'm not so sure. What is clear is that if this war ends in a way that is not very victorious for Russia, then the leadership will be under severe crisis. I mean, military losses are always a challenge to the regime in Russia. Historically, they've always created a challenge to the regime domestically, and we can look at the early 20th century, and we have very strong evidence around that.
Domitilla Sagramoso there, Senior Lecturer in Security and Development from King's College London. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.